Hello class, welcome back to Church 100 History of the Christian Church. Hope that you have been enjoying things. We are very close to the end. You have been doing a great job. Haven't had a lot of communication from you, which is perfectly fine because I know the assignments, both in this class and if you're taking any others, may become an overload to you, but I most certainly want to be available if you have any questions. Beyond this class, one of the things this material I think is enabling you to do is to have maybe better conversations with your own church family, with friends, and maybe this, because it's not so steeped in deep theology in the sense of things like hermeneuticals and hermeneutics, I should say, and other elements of study that may only apply to ministry. These are elements that would be great conversations with your church family, again, other Christians, other believers. And this book in itself is not one that is bad to share with others that they may read at least a section to awaken their thoughts. One of the things I will be honest with you as your professor, because this was not a particular textbook that I had used before, so much of this in this first run for me was new material as well, and I have thoroughly enjoyed it in the sense primarily of just seeing how certain elements are communicated in the context of the day in our context, and how certain things seem to repeat itself. We say that in general history. We say history has a tendency to repeat itself, but I think even this week as we look into revivals and awakenings, that you see that same element true again this week, again last week as well. I felt that was the case. And so I want you to do that, notice that, because I believe we learn wisdom from our past and we learn how to be better moving forward. And that is certainly a part of what we are attempting to do. Knowing the history, knowing the past is important just to understand where you come from, but learning the wisdom from it and how you can, through a lens of time and through a lens of your current circumstance, do two things. One, you can adapt some of your own ideology because you may see the era of what I would call a hyper ideology, meaning an overemphasis in certain areas. I see that a lot in Christianity and in the kingdom work, and we get kind of short-sighted on a few topics or a few issues, and we become unbalanced. And I think as you study throughout not just this week, but any of the previous weeks moving forward, for that matter, you are able to look and say, those were good principles, those were good ideas, maybe they were addressing a problem, but in some cases, not every case, but in some cases, we see that we lose maybe some of the emphasis. Even when we go back and look, we'll go back into the Church of England, there were definitely positives that occurred from the partnership, we would say, of the church and the government, in the sense of there was an assumption that everyone was partakers of the Church of England, and that gave a basis of more discipleship than evangelism, we would say. But we obviously see the errors of that. And as we move forward into this week, I hope that you keep that same lens as you look through learning, so that you may correct. And secondly, that you yourself may find balance in some of your own thinking, and when you see a problem and you want to address that problem, that we don't become unbalanced in maybe addressing that. And I can tell you as a pastor that is difficult sometimes, and it is hard at times to speak in balance and lead in balance when you see an imbalanced area. And so again, it's not a matter of being perfect here, it's just a matter of gleaning from history, learning some wisdom from it so that you may apply it moving forward. So we're going to go ahead and jump in to this week. Before I actually get into the lecture piece, let me again remind you of your upcoming assignment on your paper, your final paper, and I hope that you have started working on that so that you can have an idea of where you're headed and what you want to do throughout this paper writing. And if you have further questions, let me know. I may attempt to post, if you'll send me your question, let me say it this way, maybe any questions you have about that paper over the next few days, maybe even by the middle of this week, toward the end of this week, I might post a shorter video to address some of those questions. just so that you can have some answers and be prepared to move forward in that. So with this week, we move into a very interesting and exciting time for the church. As Americans particularly, we see the historical line of our own founding fathers and the history of our own nation here in the United States. For those outside the United States, even in the North American region, much of our history is derived in this same time period. And it's interesting as we begin to correlate not only our governmental history, our founding as the United States, here again for those in this country, but also what was going on in the church. And I think sometimes, again, even in some of our review, we can hyperanalyze one side of this and miss some elements of it. And I'll try to address a few of those for you to make reference, just so that you can be aware. So again, this is week 6, Revivals and Awakenings. In your book, most of this is classified under the Age of Reasoning and Revival, 1648 to 1789. You're reading 32 through 35. And depending on your book, I think some books, maybe the chapters are one chapter off there, but if you're missing that, have a question, let me know. But we end last week's section dealing with the issue of the undying element in the birth of denominations in England and Europe. And then we move into this element in chapter, what I have in chapter 33 that I want to speak to just a minute, what in the writing is referred to as the Age of Reasoning. And in the chapter, it's called The Cult of Reasoning. And as you read that chapter, you will kind of understand that somewhat yourself, the reason that is. But I think, again, the parallels as you read here to our present day world is actually amazing. Some of the issues that we as leaders today often would address are singular for us is actually more consistent in history, and you might would say even a part of the DNA of our own nation, particularly because it was birthed in this era of not only the Great Awakening, but the Great Enlightenment, the Enlightenment period, and on the tail of Renaissance and this modern age. And so I think it's very interesting. And so you jump into some of this parallel of even the founding fathers of the United States and this element of the Age of Reason, and how even those of faith began to evolve in their own ideology, not using that in necessarily a positive tone, but Benjamin Franklin is referenced even as an example of those that had this awakening of reason. We see in, again, not the Christianity history, but throughout the early part of this history that we're addressing, that a lot of elements of science and, quote, new truths were being discovered. And from that, it became this great awakening, not spiritually, but this great awakening of the mind, hence the phrase, the Age of Reasoning. At the top of 366 says, the spirit of the Age of Reason was nothing less than the intellectual revolution of a whole new way of looking at God, the world, and oneself. It was the birth of secularism. And so we would say it was the, in some ways, that the Age of Reasoning, or the Cult of Reasoning as the book classifies it, was the parents of secularism, just because of the ideology that began to be accepted in that day. And so we think of today in a very short-term focus of the age that we are in, what we are addressing. But as you read this, again, I don't want you to begin writing your paper on today. Again, you need to stay relevant to the history. But I do want you to glean, maybe this is a part of your journal, but I want you to read and notice that some of the issues you and I think we're facing that are new and all that may be intensified, but they actually begin all the way back in this era of the Age of Reasoning. And from that, the church has had to reformulate what we do and how we do it, which gets into application. Again, that's not the context for our paper either. That's our class. That's more missionological studies. But you do get to glean from the culture what is happening and what is combating good theology and the mission and element of the church. And so you see many of the intellectuals of the day that begin this, I'll call it blending, just because there's different layers as you read through this and different focuses of their own ideology. You see how they're beginning to mix the Bible, the elements and truths of God, and some of this age of reasoning, which do awaken the mind, and the fact that God did give us a mind. There's obviously some positive takeaways there, and understanding that how God created us, but yet the focus on where the truth originates and who determines it becomes a great question throughout the age of reasoning, and even to the point we begin to see, even in this era, the mindset shift, or the we'll say the ideology of the day shift, that each person finds truth to their own element and own degree, even to the point, and again, this is more of an American history context, but it is alluded to in here that some of the language in the founding documents became less Christian than maybe it started out, because of the age of reasoning, even though there was an element of religious freedoms that was hugely a part of those founding documents. So as you look, you can begin to see where the early fathers had, we won't say adaptions necessarily, but you can see the influence of the age of reasoning, which again was this base in knowledge, was this base in science, was this base of the mind and our own ability, as the word says, to become a reasoning element, and even to the point it become cultish in its own right. And so just want you to notice that as you look through this era. Of course, there's much more from the age of reasoning when you back into the Renaissance period, when you see how it became evolving in the beliefs from discoveries of intellect and academia to Newton's theories, to all these elements of science and knowledge, and how it began to radicalize, we would say, into a cult as it becomes, as the writer here communicates, even to the point that now those in faith are being questioned. And so anyway, I want you to note that. Going to carry us from that age of reasoning in that chapter 33, and I want you to begin to move into the next chapter, the Piast, and we're going to address what exactly was going on there, and note that we have the ability to look in the rear view instead of necessarily forward, and see the influence of this era. So we're going to continue as we look to the Piast. There is some interesting things when we start talking of John Wesley. Obviously, most know, even without some history of the church, about John Wesley. But as you begin in chapter 34, and you begin to see the age of reasoning and all that was emerging through it, there is a movement of Piasts that come even from the Roman Catholic Church, but begin to emerge in a few other contexts as well. And this issue of what one chapter title is called cheap grace, and where this theological difference begins to emerge in the Catholic Church and creates these movements. And so for review's sake, let's look at it this way. Let's look at how there are these different group societies that are subcultures inside the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of England later. And through these subgroups, we begin to see these different persuasions, these different ideologies, again, using that weight of that. And through that, we see how John Wesley is kind of brought to where he comes from. And so those opening pages really begin to lay out the issue for the movement of Piast and the others that are around that. If we look into the Pietism, we begin to see this great emergence of another subculture inside the Roman Catholic Church and even the Church of England that ultimately makes a great movement in the modern church of worldwide, even to this day. It really shifted the emphasis from, as we read through this, the emphasis of just doctrinal and political issues that we see relevant in the earlier church, where the power struggles of the church, the government, and even through the Reformation, some core doctrinal issues, we see what is said on page 385 as kind of part of our summary, is made preaching and pastoral visitation central concerns of the Protestant ministry, and even it attributes that it left a legacy of what we now would classify as small groups, devotional readings of these smaller gatherings. And so we see this personalization of faith coming out of the this generation of reasoning that kind of it becomes prevalent through time as well. And so now the church is coming in with these other societies, other groupings that bring about small groups, as again we call them today. And it really supports some key elements that we look at in the modern church today. Regeneration theologically becomes relevant. And so there's a lot of interesting dynamics in the pietist and this movement from there. Even as we look into where John Wesley comes into the later context, is the foundation that's laid in these questions and these movements that even creates a struggle for him in his own faith of this personal experience, personal revelation of God. And much of what Wesley personally experienced that birthed this mighty move, we see these smaller elements through chapter 34. And again, Pietism as being a key in that. The personal nature of this movement, this element, created the foundation of a modern revivalist, the revivalists that followed after this personal inner perspective relationship with God and this regeneration. And so it's very important as you look into chapter 34 that you see how these layers again are emerging. And one of the things to note is this isn't denominationalism at this moment occurring. This is within the Church of England, the Church of Rome, about what is emerging in their questions of subcultures. And so we see that even today. And if we want to pull out for a moment and look into a modern perspective from a historical context, is how do we create the conversations inside our culture without creating division? Now, some of these did create obviously divisions and denominations as time went, but we begin to see these groupings come together around some common themes, and that really lay a foundation of the modern awakening and the revivalists that follow. And so this is very important. So one of the other elements from evangelist context is that first, the emotional experience in part would be described as one of the keys of the pietist, and that became downplayed there. Also, the institutional church in its role is well important. You see that in that. So let's move into, as I try to bring this video closer to a close for us, is into John Wesley. I think that as we in North America look to the Great Awakening and the particular elements, we see a personalization of it in John Wesley, both theologically, where we see, as you follow through, even him and some of the other revivalists of his day, being George Whitefield, had disagreement in eternal security, the Arminian or Calvinist debate, and even created issues. They agreed to disagree, but yet later Whitefield is one of the ones that comes and creates kind of the next layer of revival on the tail of John Wesley in the Americas. But as you really begin into that chapter, one of the things I think is interesting in history is it deepens probably your understanding of John Wesley himself and some of the inner turmoil that he was dealing with, his raising, his heart, but yet there was still this missing personal transformation experience that he really lacked the clarity or faith, we might would say, of understanding and knowing what he personally had experienced. And so in the chapters regarding Wesley, you see a history of him personally, And then you see him encounter this personal experience with the Lord. And this was the light, the match that lit his fire, and he became very much a burning idea of growth. And you see that people like George Whitefield were probably better orators of bringing in crowds, but yet he found that his way to communicate was not in church, but through Whitefield was to get out into the communities and to preach, and in a variety of ways. And you see where John Wesley begins to preach. Again, he was very committed to the institution of the Church of England. He had no intention of parting ways or creating a denomination or separating, but yet he wanted a very much a revival, an awakening, not excluding the church, but rather including the church and really coming from within. And I think that's a great lesson for many of us, is that we're not attempting to create external movements or anything else, but rather to see God bring an awakening and a revival inside the movement and to be a part of that. And so as you look through, one of the headings that begins to talk about, John Wesley calls him the little giant. One of the issues with Wesley is him not being the greatest orator originally. His method was a little more detailed, but where his growth came, he's credited for being a great leader in organization and planning. And so what others may have created more of excitement and zeal, Wesley was able to bring about organization, community, and structure from that, and along at times with his brother Charles, and was able to create great gatherings of that. You see him do an extent of time of missionary work, really before his major conversion, in the sense of his fire being lit, as he alludes to in America, and really being a struggle, falling in love, it not working out. And this is what, on his return trip home, really becomes a catechism of awakening his own faith and understanding where he is personally going. And so we see his experience in America. He comes back, and now he, through a series of events, has a personal encounter with the Lord that really lights him up, and he begins teaching and preaching and creating a mass following, and being able to organize that. And so one of the things that his structure called for was societies or classes. But he had very strict rules on what they were, who was doing them, and what they were to be considered. They were not ordained ministers. They were lay leaders, and their responsibility was specific. And again, he wasn't trying to teach in the sense of class. He was trying to create a gathering, so that sharing would be encouraged. And again, we would call that more of a small group context today. And so this was all to be undergirded inside the church and the Church of England. And you see throughout reading this that he actually makes a very bold proclamation that even in his latter days, and most definitely following his death, was not true, because there became a need for the organization in America of those who were following Wesley, because there was no Church of England. That was a part of the new nation being birthed, is there was the independence of no nationalized religion. And so now these subgroups of Wesley that had kind of popped up through a variety of evangelism, preaching, and so on, now he had to create some structure and organization to create this council and the conferences that emerged, and from that, leaders that later became the American Methodist Church. And after his death, there was the separation from the Church of England. So watching John Wesley personal struggle, his failures he would consider, and then even his ability to use that and have an encounter with the Lord that then birthed what we know is the Methodist Church. And I want you to note the numbers that in a non-technological age was able to emerge strictly because of his zeal, his passion, and his commitment. And this moved into some elements of the Great Awakening inside the United States, and that occurred, and that kind of rolls us in as we close to chapter 36. And so this newness of this church, and so the church in America struggled for the first time with how to survive And what does it look like when we don't have a nationalized structure? There isn't leadership there. We can do our own thing. And so really what we would know of as denominationalism really blew up in America in growth, in the sense that there was need of some structure that, instead of now was nationalized, was now upon the local church to do. And in time, this created gatherings of people coming together for like ambition. And so we see the Baptist emerge, we see the Methodist emerge. And now, not only did they need the structure, now they must be dependent not upon the government to encourage church growth or commitment to faith, but rather on personal evangelism or church local evangelism. And we see that struggle even with the early Puritans, where in New England, they particularly tried to create some government structure so that there would be accountability to be a part of the church, a member of the church. They had half membership. And in the end, this became a failure because the new nation had this great commitment to not have nationalized religion. And specifically, as you read into that, the church, or really not really the church, but the new citizens warranted civil liberties over church membership and government-controlled church. And so it was personal decision. And so we see that in America today, still this great sense of personal civil liberties above even, we think of it in a modern context of government, this political debate now over civil liberties or governmental mandate type context. We see that in our current crisis. But this even went into religion. Does the church, where's the role of the church inside of government? And so the Puritans tried to create some structure there on the government side. And so it even created this worldly Puritan context that there was commitment to the church, but yet not personal repentance or really a holy life. And so we see this struggle that just utterly collapsed in time. And so that's when Presbyterians and Baptists again begin to see growth, begin to see this where the church takes some personal responsibility inside this. We see the great revivalists today. We mentioned George Whitefield a moment ago, where he comes in and his great revival call. We see Jonathan Edwards in each of those movements. And so all of these are creating movements and spreading revival, but not in revival of a Pentecostal nature as we may think in Pentecostalism, but this was a call of evangelism. This was now the religion had a personal responsibility to call people as followers of Christ to believe in the God of heaven, the God of the Bible. And the government said they didn't care. The government had little input politically or by leadership. And now it was the responsibility of the local church. And so this great immersion of revivalists that are now spreading the gospel. And this is the Great Awakening, where we see people coming into salvation and following Christ through again these great revivalists of the day. And so this kind of connects us to what follows, but this is a simple review for you of seeing the church emerging from the Church of England and these societies, these as John Wesley's, but these different groups that begin to have questions, begin to want to create foundations of issues that would birth movements. And so in spite of the season and age of reasoning. And so things that you may have known historically outside of the church, hopefully in this chapter, these chapters, you will see the connection of greater movements in the church, particularly in the Great Awakening. And so I want you to personally note and notice that the Great Awakening that we would call for a great move or revival, and the wonderful nature of that the part that the age of reasoning played in that, and the part of not only the age of reasoning across the globe, but specifically in the North America, the new nation of the United States, in this great desire and commitment of civil liberties, where the government had very little control as opposed to in the Church of England or in the Church of Rome before it, into this separation. Now we hear separation of church and state, honestly, in the United States, more from a government side. But there was a cry of the people in this era that the government would not mandate or would not tell them how to worship. And mixed with the age of reasoning, we see now where secularism, as we talked about earlier, birth, where people begin to create for the first time not only a non-nationalized government, not only a denominationalism context, but now a very personal hybrid of each person's own faith. So you see the Benjamin Franklins and others that are notable in the sense of their own method of understanding God that isn't always in agreement to the Word of God, but because of the age of reasoning, they now have an awakening of reason that they can view God. And so we see all of these things happening simultaneously, and the need of a great awakening or a revivalist, evangelistic call. So just kind of bring all that together in your thoughts and see them not separate, but how they work together, and why God really ordained this great awakening and its need to put this new nation into some understanding of who God is in the Word. So hope that works. You'll have 5 questions or 5 types of questions this week in the 5 core areas. And so there's 2 of those that you can pick, A or B. And so again, 5 questions, answer them all. I know these are a little more lengthy type answers and questions, but I need to see that you're engaging with the text, and I'm trying to help you think about the text and respond to it. And so again, as always, if you have any questions, let me know. Also, as I said, as we began, if you have questions regarding your final paper, send those to me. If it's a really specific one, we'll answer in email. But if I get several regarding kind of how to do this and what I'm looking for, I will try to answer those for everyone by video, or at least in on the main page there. So God bless you. Hope that you're learning and growing, and look forward to this week 6. God bless.